The transport ship's engine screamed as it tore through Earth's atmosphere, hull plates glowing white-hot from emergency re-entry. Inside the cramped medical bay, Captain Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the bulkhead, feeling the violent shuddering that meant they were pushing beyond safe limits. "How long until we reach the palace?" she asked the pilot through her comm. 12 minutes if we don't burn up first." Elena looked down at the figure strapped to the medical gurney. Major Thomas Chen's face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, his breathing shallow and labored. Shrapnel from the Zephyrian plasma cannons had torn through his left side, missing his heart by centimeters. The auto dock kept him stable, but barely. 3 days ago, Chen had led the final assault on Kepler Station. Against impossible odds, his battalion of 200 humans had faced down 8,000 Zephyrian shock troops. The station's quantum core would have powered their entire war fleet if it had fallen into enemy hands. Chen held the line for 18 hours straight, buying time for the evacuation of 40,000 civilians. He was the only survivor. The transport bucked violently as they hit the outer atmosphere. Elena gripped the gurney rails, watching Chen's vital signs spike red on the monitors. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with pain medication. "Elena?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, Tom. We're almost home. The civilians, safe. All of them. Because of you." A weak smile crossed his lips before consciousness faded again. The royal palace sprawled across the horizon like a gleaming city, its towers reaching toward the stars humanity now called home among a dozen worlds. Queen Isabella Martinez stood in the observation deck of the medical wing, her ceremonial robes replaced by simple civilian clothes. She'd been waiting here for 6 hours, ever since word came that Chen's transport had launched from the battlefield. Dr. Sarah Kim approached from behind. "Your Majesty, the surgery could take 12 hours. Perhaps you should..." "I'm not leaving." Isabella's voice carried the quiet authority that had guided humanity through 15 years of interstellar war. She was 38, but the weight of command and loss had aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of rigid control. The transport's roar grew louder. Isabella watched through the reinforced windows as the ship descended toward the medical landing pad, its belly glowing like a fallen star. Emergency crews scattered across the tarmac, medical equipment gleaming under the harsh landing lights. "He saved my daughter," Isabella said quietly. "Doctor..." Kim nodded. Princess Carmen had been on Kepler Station, part of a diplomatic mission when the Zephyrians attacked. Chen's defiance of direct orders to retreat had kept the evacuation routes open long enough for her transport to escape. The ship touched down with a thunderous crash that shook the entire wing. Isabella moved toward the elevator, her guard detail falling into formation around her. Protocol demanded she remain in the observation deck, but protocol had never stopped her from honoring those who bled for humanity's survival. The medical bay doors burst open as the trauma team rushed Chen's gurney inside. Isabella stepped forward and the corridor fell silent. Doctors, nurses, and guards all stopped, uncertain how to react to their queen's presence in the emergency ward. Elena Vasquez saluted sharply. "Your Majesty, Major Chen's condition is critical but stable." Isabella approached the gurney. Chen's face was ashen, his breathing supported by machines, but his eyes opened when she spoke his name. "Thomas." He tried to sit up, but Isabella placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Rest, soldier. Your Majesty." His voice was weak but determined. "Princess Carmen, is she?" "Safe. Thanks to you." Relief flooded across his face. "Good. That's good." Isabella felt something break inside her chest. This man had sacrificed everything. His entire battalion, his own body, to save strangers he would never meet. To save her daughter. To save the future of humanity itself. The medical team waited, poised to wheel Chen into surgery. Isabella knew she should step back, let them work, maintain the dignity and distance expected of a monarch. Instead, she leaned closer. "You held the line, Thomas, against 8,000. You held the line. Someone had to." His eyes closed again, and the medical team moved him toward the operating theater. Isabella watched until the doors closed behind them, sealing Chen away from sight. Dr. Kim approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, would you like me to arrange quarters for you to rest?" Isabella shook her head. She turned toward the waiting area, her guard detail maintaining their protective formation. "I'll wait here." "But your majesty, the surgery." "I said I'll wait here." The corridor emptied except for Isabella and her guards. She settled into a chair facing the operating theater, her posture straight and regal even in the uncomfortable plastic seat. Outside, the war continued. Fleets maneuvered in distant star systems, diplomats negotiated treaties that would be broken within weeks. But here, in this sterile corridor, humanity's queen kept vigil over a wounded warrior who had given everything for people he didn't know, simply because it was right. The surgical lights glowed behind frosted glass, and Isabella began her long wait. The surgery stretched through the night. Isabella remained in her chair, refusing food and sleeping only in brief moments when exhaustion overtook her vigilance. Her guards rotated shifts, but she stayed constant as the palace came alive around her with the business of ruling an interstellar civilization. At dawn, her personal secretary approached with a tablet full of urgent matters requiring immediate attention. Isabella glanced at the surgical theater doors, still sealed and glowing with activity. "Schedule them for later. Your Majesty, the Centauri trade negotiations, later." Word of the Queen's vigil spread through the palace corridors like wildfire. By mid-morning, a steady stream of staff found reasons to pass through the medical wing, each hoping to catch a glimpse of their monarch maintaining her solitary watch. None dared approach directly, but Isabella felt their presence, their curiosity, their unspoken questions about why she would spend precious hours waiting for one wounded soldier. The answer was simple, though she couldn't explain it to them. Thomas Chen represented something essential about humanity that no amount of technology or political maneuvering could replace. When everything else failed, when overwhelming odds demanded surrender, humans like Chen simply refused to quit. Dr. Kim emerged from the operating theater at noon, her surgical mask pulled down to reveal exhaustion and cautious optimism. "The surgery was successful, Your Majesty. We removed all the shrapnel and repaired the internal damage. He's stable." Isabella stood slowly, her joints protesting hours of motionless waiting. "When will he wake up?" "Several hours, possibly longer. The trauma was extensive. I want to see him." The recovery room was sterile and quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Chen lay motionless under white sheets, his face peaceful but drained of color. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that tracked every heartbeat, every breath. Isabella approached the bedside, her guards maintaining their positions near the door. She studied Chen's face, memorizing the features of a man who had embodied the best of humanity when it mattered most. "He'll be awarded the Star of Valor," she said quietly to Dr. B. "Kim, he deserves it." Isabella nodded, though the medal felt inadequate. "How do you honor someone who sacrificed 200 lives under his command to save 40,000 strangers? How do you quantify that kind of courage?" A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Princess Carmen entered, still wearing the simple clothes she'd arrived in from Kepler Station. At 19, she carried herself with her mother's dignity, but retained the warmth that Isabella had lost somewhere in the years of war and responsibility. "Mother, I heard about Major Chen." Isabella turned to her daughter. Carmen's eyes were red from crying, her usual composure shattered by the weight of survivor's guilt. "He lost his entire battalion saving us," Carmen whispered. 200 soldiers died because of me." "They died doing their duty," Isabella corrected gently. "Protecting innocent lives. That's what soldiers do. But you should have nothing. You were where duty placed you, just as Chen was where duty placed him." Carmen moved to the other side of Chen's bed, staring down at the man who had sacrificed so much for her safety. "I want to thank him when he wakes up." "We'll both be here." The afternoon passed slowly. Isabella and Carmen maintained their vigil together, speaking occasionally in whispers about the war, about duty, about the terrible mathematics of sacrifice that govern their lives. Guards changed shifts outside the door. Doctors checked equipment and monitored Chen's progress. As evening approached, Chen's breathing pattern changed. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, and his fingers twitched slightly against the sheets. "He's waking up," Dr. Kim observed, checking his monitors. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. Carmen moved closer to the bed, her young face tight with nervous anticipation. Chen's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus in the soft light of the recovery room. His gaze found Isabella first, and confusion flickered across his features. "Your Majesty?" His voice was hoarse but stronger than before. "Welcome back, Thomas." His eyes shifted to Carmen, and recognition dawned. He tried to sit up, but Isabella gestured for him to remain still. "Princess," he whispered. Carmen stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "Major Chen, I wanted to thank you for saving us." Her voice broke. Isabella watched her daughter struggle with words that couldn't possibly capture the magnitude of Chen's sacrifice. The Queen understood that struggle intimately. "How do you thank someone for everything?" Chen's response surprised them both. "Princess, you don't need to thank me. That's not why we do it." "Then why?" Chen was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Because you represent the future. All of you civilians we evacuated, you represent everything we're fighting to preserve. Humanity's curiosity, compassion, hope. Soldiers like me, we're expendable, but what you represent, that's irreplaceable." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. This wounded warrior understood something that all her political advisors and military strategists missed. The war wasn't about territory or resources or even survival. It was about preserving the essence of what made humanity worth preserving. Carmen wiped tears from her eyes. 200 soldiers died for us. 200 soldiers died for what you represent, Chen corrected gently. That's not the same thing, and they didn't die in vain. The monitors continued their steady beeping. Outside, the palace hummed with activity as the machinery of government continued its relentless pace. But in this quiet room, 3 people shared a moment of perfect understanding about duty, sacrifice, and the true cost of preserving civilization. Isabella knew she would remember this conversation for the rest of her reign. The evening light filtered through the recovery room windows as Isabella finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Chen was stable, conscious, and would recover. The immediate crisis had passed, but she found herself reluctant to leave. "Your Majesty," Dr. Kim approached carefully. "Visiting hours are technically over, and Major Chen needs rest." Isabella nodded but didn't move toward the door. 5 more minutes. Carmen had fallen asleep in her chair beside Chen's bed, emotionally exhausted from the day's revelations. The young princess looked peaceful for the first time since returning from Kepler Station, as though Chen's survival had lifted some invisible burden from her conscience. "She blames herself," Chen observed quietly, following Isabella's gaze. "She thinks your battalion died because she was there. They died because duty placed them there, just like it placed her there." Chen's voice carried absolute certainty. No one chooses where they're needed most. Isabella studied this wounded warrior who spoke with such clarity about concepts that kept her awake at night. In 15 years of ruling during wartime, she'd met thousands of soldiers, officers, and heroes, but few possessed Chen's ability to see through the complexities of command to the simple truth underneath. "Tell me about your battalion," she said softly. Chen's expression grew distant. "Good soldiers. Most were young, some were veterans. They knew the odds when we took the station. They knew we probably wouldn't all make it home. Do you remember their names?" "Everyone." Isabella believed him. Something in his tone suggested he would carry those names until his dying day, not as a burden but as a responsibility. "The memorial service is scheduled for next week," Isabella said. "I'll be delivering the eulogy. They'd be honored, Your Majesty. What should I tell their families?" Chen considered this carefully. Tell them their sons and daughters died as humans, facing impossible odds, protecting people they didn't know because it was right. Tell them humanity endures because of people like them. Isabella nodded, filing away his words. She'd delivered dozens of memorial addresses, but none felt as important as this one would be. A soft chime indicated visiting hours were over. Carmen stirred in her chair, blinking awake in the dim room. "Mother, is everything all right? Everything's fine, dear? We should let Major Chen rest." Carmen stood and approached Chen's bedside. "Thank you again, Major, for everything." "It was my honor, Princess." Isabella moved to follow her daughter but paused at the door. Something had been nagging at her all day. A question she needed answered. "Thomas, you had direct orders to retreat. Why did you disobey them?" Chen met her eyes without hesitation. "Because orders can be wrong, but duty never is." The simple statement hit Isabella like a physical blow. In one sentence, this wounded warrior had encapsulated the moral complexity that governed every decision she made as queen. Sometimes protocol conflicted with purpose. Sometimes regulations hindered rather than helped. Sometimes doing right meant breaking rules. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. As Isabella and Carmen left the recovery room, the queen felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine hope. Not the carefully maintained optimism required for public appearance, but real hope based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. Humanity would survive this war, not because of superior technology or brilliant strategy, but because people like Thomas Chen would keep fighting when everything else failed, because they understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. The corridor outside was empty except for guards and medical staff. Isabella walked slowly, processing the day's events and their implications for her reign. Carmen matched her pace, both of them lost in their own thoughts. "Mother, what Major Chen said about duty, do you agree with him?" Isabella considered the question carefully. As queen, her primary obligation was to the law, to the Constitution, to the established order that kept humanity functioning across a dozen star systems. But as a human being, she understood that sometimes higher principles demanded flexibility in how those obligations were fulfilled. "I think," she said finally, "that duty is more complicated than any of us want to admit." They reached the royal quarters as the palace settled into its nighttime routine. Isabella paused at her daughter's door, watching Carmen's face in the soft hallway light. "Are you all right, dear?" "I think so. What Major Chen said helped. About representing the future rather than just being rescued." Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in days. "He's a wise man. Will he stay on active duty? That's his choice. But men like him usually choose to keep serving." Carmen nodded and disappeared into her quarters. Isabella continued to her own rooms, but found herself too restless for sleep. Instead, she stood at her window, overlooking the city below, lights stretching to the horizon like fallen stars. Somewhere out there, the war continued. Fleets maneuvered in distant systems. Soldiers prepared for battles that might decide the fate of human civilization. But tonight, one wounded warrior rested peacefully in the palace medical wing, carrying the names of 200 dead heroes and the gratitude of 40,000 living souls. Isabella finally understood why she'd spent the day keeping vigil. It wasn't about protocol or politics or public relations. It was about bearing witness to the kind of courage that made leadership meaningful. Without people like Thomas Chen willing to make impossible sacrifices, her crown was just an expensive piece of metal. With them, she helped guide the greatest civilization humanity had ever achieved. The next morning brought urgent reports from 3 different star systems. Isabella reviewed them in her office while drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The Zephyrian fleet was regrouping near Proxima Centauri. Trade negotiations with the Rigel colonies had stalled. The Kepler Station reconstruction would require resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Each problem demanded immediate attention and carried consequences that could ripple across human space for generations. Isabella attacked them with her usual methodical precision, but found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the medical wing 3 floors below. At noon, she cleared her schedule and returned to check on Chen's progress. She told herself it was a courtesy visit, nothing more. Queens were expected to visit wounded heroes. It was good for morale. The truth was more complicated. Chen was sitting up in bed when she arrived, his color much improved and his eyes alert. Dr. Kim reported excellent progress. The worst of the damage had been repaired, and rehabilitation could begin within days. "Your Majesty," Chen attempted to stand, but Isabella gestured for him to remain seated. "How are you feeling?"
"Much better, thank you."
"Kim says I'll make a full recovery." Isabella settled into the chair beside his bed, the same one she'd occupied during her long vigil. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about orders being wrong but duty never being wrong." Chen nodded carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer." "Of course, Your Majesty." Isabella leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. Do you think I'm fighting this war correctly? The question hung in the air between them. Chen stared at her for a long moment, clearly recognizing the weight of what she was asking. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was a queen seeking honest counsel from someone whose judgment she trusted. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to... You're qualified. You've seen this war from the ground up. You've made life and death decisions under impossible circumstances. You understand what we're really fighting for. So I'm asking again, am I doing this right? Chen was quiet for several minutes, considering his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same conviction she'd heard the day before. You're fighting a war that can't be won with conventional tactics against an enemy that doesn't think like us. But you're not just trying to survive. You're trying to preserve something worth surviving for. That makes every decision harder, but it also makes them more important. That's not an answer. Yes, it is, Your Majesty. You're caught between winning quickly and winning correctly. Most leaders would choose speed. You're choosing to do it right, even when it costs more. Isabella absorbed this assessment. She thought about the decisions she'd made over the past year, rejecting first-strike options that might have ended the war faster but at terrible moral cost, maintaining supply lines to civilian populations even when military efficiency demanded otherwise, refusing to abandon scattered colonies that strategic logic said were indefensible. The Admiralty wants me to authorize the Phobos Protocol, she said quietly. Chen's expression darkened. The Phobos Protocol was humanity's ultimate weapon, a cascade of quantum disruptions that could destroy entire star systems, including any planets they contained. It would end the war instantly, but at the cost of billions of Zephyrian civilian lives. What do you think? She asked. I think that's why they made you queen instead of me, Chen replied carefully. That's still not an answer. Chen met her eyes directly. Your Majesty, if you authorize Phobos, we'll win the war, but lose ourselves. If you don't authorize it, we might lose everything, but we'll still be human when it's over. Isabella nodded slowly. It was the answer she'd expected, and it confirmed her own instincts. The war would continue. People would die, but humanity would emerge with its soul intact. Thank you, Thomas. That's exactly what I needed to hear. A knock at the door interrupted them. Isabella's secretary entered with an apologetic expression. Your Majesty, the Joint Chiefs need an immediate response on the Phobos authorization. Isabella stood, her decision crystallized by the conversation with Chen. Tell them the authorization is denied, permanently. The secretary left and Isabella turned back to Chen. I should go. The war doesn't wait for anyone. Your Majesty, Chen called as she reached the door. For what it's worth, I think you're the right person to lead us through this, whatever the cost. Isabella paused, feeling the weight of those words. The cost keeps getting higher. It always does, but some things are worth any price. As Isabella left the medical wing, she carried Chen's words with her like armor against the difficult decisions ahead. The war would continue, perhaps for years. More heroes would die. More impossible choices would demand her attention. But humanity would endure, not just as a species, but as an ideal worth defending. And when future generations looked back on these dark years, they would see that their queen chose the harder path, because it was the right one. In his recovery room, Thomas Chen watched through the window as Isabella's transport lifted off from the palace, carrying her back to the business of governing a civilization at war. He thought about their conversation and the decision she'd just made to reject the easy path to victory. That's why she was queen, and he was just a soldier. But sometimes, soldiers and queens fought for the same things, in their own ways. The war raged on across a dozen star systems, but humanity's heart remained steady. And in the end, that made all the difference. 2 weeks later, Isabella stood before a crowd of 10,000 in the palace's Great Hall, delivering the memorial address for Chen's battalion. The families of the fallen filled the first 100 rows, their faces reflecting grief, pride, and the terrible mathematics of wartime loss. Isabella had written and rewritten her speech a dozen times, but when the moment came, she found herself abandoning her prepared remarks. Instead, she spoke from the heart about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. 200 soldiers died at Kepler Station, she began, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. They died as humans, facing impossible odds, protecting people they had never met, because it was right. They died so that 40,000 civilians could live, so that humanity's future could continue, so that the values we hold dear could survive another day. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the assembly. Their memorial is not this gathering, though we honor them here. Their memorial is every child who will grow up free because of their sacrifice. Their memorial is every world that remains unconquered. Their memorial is the civilization we will build when this war ends, a civilization worthy of their sacrifice. In the medical wing, Thomas Chen watched the address on his room's view screen. He was scheduled for discharge the next day, returning to active duty despite offers of a comfortable staff position. Some fights were too important to observe from the sidelines. Isabella's words reached him clearly through the speakers, and he found himself thinking of his fallen soldiers. She was right. Their true memorial would be the world they died to preserve, a world where queens could choose the harder path because it was right, where soldiers could disobey orders in service of higher duty, where the best of humanity endured even in the darkest times. The address concluded to thunderous applause, but Isabella wasn't finished. She had one more announcement to make. I want to share something with you that one of our heroes taught me recently. He said that orders can be wrong, but duty never is. I want every person in this hall, every citizen of our great civilization, to remember those words. When protocols fail us, when regulations constrain us, when the easy path beckons, remember that duty calls us to something higher. Isabella's eyes found the camera that would carry her words across human space. We will win this war, not through overwhelming force or superior technology, but because we fight for something worth preserving. We fight for the idea that consciousness and compassion matter more than conquest. We fight for the belief that every life has value. We fight for the future our children deserve. She stepped back from the podium as the crowd erupted in sustained applause. The memorial was over, but its message would echo across human space for generations. Later that evening, Isabella visited Chen one final time before his discharge. He was packing his few belongings, preparing to return to the war that had claimed so much, but taught them both so much more. "I heard your speech," he said without looking up. "It was perfect. I hope their families felt that way." Chen turned to face her, his expression serious. "Your Majesty, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When this war finally ends, what kind of peace are you planning to build?" Isabella considered the question carefully. It was one that kept her awake at night, the responsibility that waited beyond victory or defeat. "The kind of peace worthy of their sacrifice," she said finally. "One where the values they died for become the foundation of everything we build afterward." Chen nodded approvingly. "That's the right answer. And you, Thomas? What will you do when the war ends?" "Whatever needs doing, Your Majesty." "That's what soldiers do." Isabella smiled, recognizing the truth in his simple statement. She extended her hand, and Chen shook it firmly. "It has been an honor, Major Chen." "The honor was mine, Your Majesty." As Isabella left the medical wing for the final time, she carried with her the lessons learned during these intense weeks. The conversation with the wounded warrior had crystallized her understanding of leadership, duty, and the true cost of preserving civilization. The war continued, but something fundamental had changed. Isabella now governed with absolute clarity about what they were fighting for and why. The harder path was always the right path. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, Thomas Chen returned to battle with renewed purpose, carrying the names of 200 fallen heroes and the gratitude of a queen who had learned what it truly meant to serve. Humanity's future remained uncertain, but its heart was strong, and in the end that heart would prove more powerful than any weapon, more enduring than any empire, more valuable than any treasure the galaxy could offer. The queen had wept for a wounded warrior, and in that moment of genuine emotion, both had discovered the unshakable truth that would carry their species through its darkest hour and into the light beyond.